just looking at the different mechanisms that made all of this happen. So this is not just one guy, Stalin, having a
Right.
policy. There's a whole system. Uh, I mean, one of it is just a system of fear. But how do you implement that system of fear?
Well,
Right?
what?
There's a giant bureaucracy of fear.
Yeah. So what he implemented with the Great Terror is
That's in the 30s, in the late 30s.
it's throughout the 30s, but yeah, like it starts in the mid to late 30s. Basically, communism was based on the common good and the public good, and anything private, which was bourgeois, was a problem. When they were started, when the revolution came, the October Revolution, they wanted to recreate society entirely, and that included like, okay, let's make it so everyone eats in like cafeterias, so they're not eating by themselves. Let's design buildings so everyone has to share bathrooms. Like their whole plan was to have eliminate any kind of concept of privacy at all. They also had this bizarre kind of radical idea of like attacking shame. So many of these, before the 1917, people were also very involved with like free love. Because the idea of like having this private bond between husband and wife was also bourgeois and old fashioned, and we're the society of the future. That changed relatively quickly, but they were talking about things like raising kids communally,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth. So for Stalin, if you and I are friends, we have a bond that's a threat to him. The
Mm-hmm.
family's a threat. The any kind of organization is a threat because it's a power center that is not between a relationship between you and him. Now you have a relationship with somebody else. So he systemically went through that whole society, and it became there were certain things that became a crime. Then it became a crime to be a spouse
Mm-hmm.
of the enemy of the people. Now right away, I as a child become an orphan because my dad was an enemy of the people, my mom is married to an enemy of the people. Now I don't have parents, they get arrested or executed or whatever. But now I have nowhere to go, but I can't go to my friend's house because their family doesn't want to take in a child of the enemy of the people. You had this culture where everyone was very much encouraged to turn people in, and if you're arrested, and tortured, you're like, okay, who are your accomplices? And now you just got to name names, people you knew. And then it becomes this whole chain. And it's like, how am I going to protest my innocence if Lex just said, I worked with Michael and we were working with Trotskyists and we were plotting to overthrow Stalin. Lex testified to this. He signed a confession. What am I supposed to do now? Right. So it worked its way in a most viral fashion through the whole society. There was this amazing moment where these poor people, peasants, because obviously the powerless are often going to be caught in the web, they were going to jail for being Trotskyites, and they had to ask themselves, what's a tractorist? Like they didn't even know who Trotsky was.
Mm-hmm.
And other thing is, ethnicity was a problem, right? If you were an ethnicity, you have more power with other members of that ethnicity than you have with this kind of broader Soviet culture. So he would just deport entire populations from their ancestral lands to other parts, to spread the population around, but also to break that link between the peoples and their lands. There was this 1937 NKVD order against Polish people where it's just like, if you had come from Poland or had just this whole list, and basically people were being arrested because they had Polish last names, and I think it was 1 million people were killed, like some astronomical number. So there was this anything that was a bond was a threat to him, and it went systemically. So after he had all these kind of executions of people who were like Lenin's people, the old Bolsheviks, then he started arresting the secret police. He arrested all the cops, he arrested all the judges, and all these prisoners got to see the judges who yelled at them for being counter-revolutionaries and spies. Now they were in the jails. If you were a foreigner, if there was a huge push from the Soviet Union toward African Americans, right? Because they're like, look, you were living in a racist country. Here we have no racial inequality. Come live here. A bunch of them went, and they were all vanished. Anyone who knew information about the outside world, if you were a foreigner, Andre Babel, I forget his first name. He had a French writer he was friends with. He was arrested and shot because he's a spy, because you're friends with Melrose. And that means if you know a foreigner, you're a spy. Speaking Esperanto became a crime. Having a pen pal, literally anything that was some kind of chain between yourself and someone else was a threat and was grounds for arrest. It was the Russians would joke about how relieved they would be if someone knocked on your door in the middle of the night to tell you your house was on fire, because it wasn't the NKVD coming to arrest you.
And of course, most of the accusations probably were completely false. So not only could you not do all of those things, you were also a victim of just
Being
random.
late to work became a felony, and also not doing your job became a felony because now you're taking food or product away from the people, and you're supposed to be there working for the people. There's this one story which I was doing the audiobook, and this is like I still trying to get through without crying. This was 1920. They were a bunch of kids in Moscow who were pickpockets, between ages 11 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
They rounded them up, and they're like, all right, point out your accomplices. And they would take them in the trams, and you have to point out people. Then they would take them back to the cellar, beat the crap out of these children, and then they take them out again. And if they didn't point out to anybody, they'd beat them. They're like, all right. So they just start pointing at random.
Yeah.
And the thing that was really sick about this story, if that wasn't sick enough, is that the screams that the other criminals, the adult hardened criminals, had to hear from these children as they realized they were being taken back to the cellar. It was just horrifying.
And they tortured people. They tortured confessions out of people.
Yes.
At scale.
Oh, yes.
I mean, and the dark aspect of this is it's like this weird, it's a bureaucracy of torture.
Yes.
So like, it's not like there's, what is it? The torturer is afraid of, like, does it so that he doesn't become the prisoner.
Right,
basically.
Because then it's like, oh, you couldn't get a confession out of him? Are you an enemy of the people now as well? And the thing that was even crazier is that a lot of these interrogators were frustrated because they're like, look, we both know you're innocent. Just sign this confession and make my life easier. They knew it was crap. Stalin joked about this. This is one of his little jokes. There was a kid who was arrested, and he was forced to say, you wrote Eugene Onegin, which is a play. He goes, that play was by Pushkin. And they tortured him. And then his parents are walking down the street, and they run into a secret police, and they go, congratulations. And they go, for what? They go, your son wrote Eugene Onegin. Like, he admitted to it last night. Like, it's just like they could get you to say anything. And what else was really, really sick, which they understood, is they lowered the death penalty for kids, I think, to either 14 or 12. I don't remember off the top of my head. And what Stalin's head of the secret police did is when you were interrogating someone, you either had to have some of your family member's possessions on the desk, or a copy of the decree that's saying that they can go after your family. And the amount of people who would confess to anything when they saw their family was in danger, and they knew this wasn't a bluff, was astronomical. And then it becomes a chain. Because if you confess, and I have your confession, how hard is it to get your neighbor?